How an offshore trust can make your assets bulletproof. Trusts are originally a British concept. They were originally established centuries ago when the British landed nobility were going to war. They would leave their affairs to be managed by others in a trust with strict instructions on how their assets were to be managed. When they returned from war, the trustees would return the assets to the nobles. There are 3 layers to a trust. You have the settlor, the beneficiary, and the trustees. The settlor is the person or entity who establishes the trust. The beneficiaries are those who will benefit from the assets owned by the trust in the future. The trustees manage the trust on behalf of the beneficiaries. Offshore trusts and foundations work in exactly the same way as their onshore equivalents. Offshore trusts offer a greater level of privacy and protection. The trustees have instructions on how to manage the assets and how they are to be dispersed. The settlor, although he doesn't control or own the assets, may have significant input into what happens to them. Ironclad legal protection for your assets held in an offshore trust. The reason that trusts have stood the test of time over centuries is that they provide a clear legal separation of the assets of an individual from the assets of the trust. When you transfer assets to a trust or a foundation, you no longer own them legally. Offshore trusts add another layer of protection for the settlor and beneficiaries. It's often impossible for any hostile creditor to discover any information about the assets and activities of the offshore trust or foundation. The assets can't be seized by your creditors. Trust law in some jurisdictions even has legislation to stop anyone from being forced to transfer the assets of the trust under duress. Use an offshore trust to protect your assets even if you haven't decided on the beneficiaries yet. Some offshore jurisdictions such as the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands have modernized the trust with the introduction of the Star Trust. These structures make it easier to remove trustees and let the settlor keep more control of the affairs of the trust. These structures are more like living trusts that do not have to nominate beneficiaries when they are set up. This lets you transfer your wealth out of your legal ownership while still keeping control. You can decide on the beneficiaries at a later date. Set up an offshore trust in the most private jurisdictions. Liechtenstein is the home of the original foundation, which is basically a European version of the British Trust. Liechtenstein foundations are largely impenetrable. Panama updated the foundation structure with its own version of the Liechtenstein Foundation. This, combined with Panama's strong privacy laws and aversion to cooperating with foreign jurisdictions, makes it a good option. The Cook Islands and Nevis also have strong privacy laws and legislation which makes their trusts impenetrable. Use an offshore trust to preserve generational wealth by avoiding inheritance tax. Trusts and foundations are a good option to preserve generational wealth. Because they are not owned by you, they are not affected by any financial mishaps such as legal judgments or even bankruptcy. The trust will be at the top of your offshore pyramid. It can own shares in your offshore companies, which may in turn own assets in your home country or other high-tax jurisdictions. Protect assets prior to marriage. Assets owned by a trust prior to marriage will not be considered matrimonial property. They will be excluded from any future divorce settlement. Secure assets before moving to a high-tax country. Assets placed in a trust before you move to a high-tax country will not be taxed there as they're not owned by you. Anyone with substantial assets to protect should consider using an offshore trust. There are a wide variety of jurisdictions that will work well. The risks that you face and the jurisdiction where you live will determine the best overall strategy that will work best in your circumstances.